They lived together for 50 years, but before his death, the wife discovered a terrible secret. Eleonora "Ellie" Johnson sat beside the hospital bed that had taken over their living room, watching her husband of almost 50 years. Robert "Bob" Thompson's once golden hair had long since turned white, but his blue eyes, when open, still held the same intensity that had caught her attention all those years ago. Now those eyes were closed as he slept, the cancer medications flowing through his veins. She adjusted his pillow gently, careful not to wake him. At 75, her hands weren't as steady as they once were, but after decades as a nurse before retirement, these motions came naturally. The Victorian house on Maple Street in Willowbrook, Connecticut had been their home for nearly 5 decades. Now it felt like a museum of memories, with photographs lining every wall, evidence of a life well lived. Ellie glanced at the family portrait above the fireplace. Their 3 children had all found success in their own ways. Michael, their oldest, was a cardiac surgeon in Boston. Sarah had become a federal judge in Washington, and James, their youngest, traveled the world as an award-winning jazz musician. The picture had been taken at their 40th anniversary celebration, all of them smiling widely. "Water," Bob murmured, his voice barely audible. Ellie reached for the glass with the bendy straw. "Here you go, honey," she said, helping him take small sips. "Thank you," he whispered, his eyes focusing on her face. "My beautiful Ellie." She smiled, remembering when they'd first met in 1967 at the university library. She'd been studying nursing, he was already an assistant professor of English literature. Their connection had been immediate and powerful, despite the challenges they would face. They'd married in 1968, just 1 year after interracial marriage had become legal in all states. The small ceremony in her parents' backyard had been attended by only a handful of supportive friends and family members. Both their families had struggled with their union, her Black Baptist parents concerned about the difficulties their daughter would face, his white conservative family openly disapproving. Willowbrook hadn't been ready for them either. The first black nurse at the local hospital married to a white professor at the prestigious university had raised eyebrows and sparked whispers. But they'd faced it all together, head-on. The phone rang, pulling Ellie from her memories. It was Michael. "Hey, Mom. How's Dad today?" "About the same," she replied, moving to the kitchen to talk. "The doctor increased his pain medication yesterday." "I'll be there tomorrow," Michael said. "Sarah's trying to wrap up a case to come too." "That would be nice, honey. Your father would love to see you all." After hanging up, Ellie returned to Bob's side. He'd fallen back asleep, his breathing labored. She picked up the novel she'd been reading to him, Hemingway, his favorite, but her eyes drifted to the photo album on the side table instead. She flipped through pages of their history, their honeymoon at Niagara Falls, the birth of each child, family vacations, graduations, weddings. Each milestone captured and preserved. Pausing at a photo from 1973, she noticed something she'd never paid attention to before. Bob had just returned from a conference in Boston, and in the picture, he was hugging 3-year-old Michael. The timeline suddenly struck her as odd. She'd been 7 months pregnant with Sarah when he'd gone to that 3-day conference. She'd been so sick that time, managing alone with a toddler while throwing up constantly. "Catherine," Bob murmured in his sleep, his brow furrowing. "Who?" Ellie asked, startled. But Bob had drifted deeper into sleep, his face relaxing again. Must be the medication, Ellie thought. Probably a character from one of his beloved novels. She closed the album and reached for his hand, entwining her fingers with his. His skin felt paper-thin now, but his grip was still there, still holding on to her as he had for 50 years. "We made it, Bob," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. 50 years, against all odds. No secrets, no regrets. The irony of her words hung in the air, unnoticed as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across their living room. The next morning, Ellie woke with a stiff neck from dozing in the armchair beside Bob's bed. The hospice nurse had already arrived and was checking his vitals. "He had a peaceful night," the nurse whispered. "Why don't you take some time for yourself while I'm here? Maybe get some fresh air." Ellie nodded gratefully. After a quick shower and breakfast, she decided to tackle a task she'd been putting off: organizing Bob's important papers. With the inevitable approaching, she needed to have insurance policies, bank statements, and other documents in order. Bob's study had remained largely untouched since his retirement 3 years ago. Dust covered the shelves of literature books and academic journals. His old typewriter still sat on the desk, though he'd switched to a computer years ago. The room smelled of old paper and the pipe tobacco he'd given up when the kids were born. Ellie pulled open the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, searching for the life insurance folder. Not finding it there, she looked toward the tall bookshelf where Bob sometimes stashed important papers behind his first editions. Standing on tiptoes, she reached behind a row of Hemingway novels. Her fingers touched something in an envelope, not the folder she sought. Curious, she pulled it out. The yellowed envelope was addressed to Bob at his university office, postmarked 1973. The return address showed C. Miller, with a Boston address. Something about the date nagged at her memory: 1973, when Michael was a toddler and she was pregnant with Sarah. With shaking hands, Ellie opened the unsealed envelope and pulled out a handwritten letter. "Dear Bob," it began in neat, feminine handwriting. "Our son turned 3 yesterday. He has your eyes. How long will you keep up this perfect husband charade? If you don't tell your wife about us, I will." Ellie sank into Bob's desk chair, her heart pounding. "Our son. Your eyes." The words blurred as her vision swam. The letter continued, describing meetings at a hotel in Boston during academic conferences that Bob attended 3 times yearly. There were references to money transfer, significant amounts that coincided with times Bob had claimed their investments were underperforming. Suddenly, the photo she'd noticed yesterday made terrible sense. Bob's conference, when she was pregnant with Sarah. He'd been with this Catherine Miller and a child. A son. His son. With growing horror, Ellie searched deeper behind the books. There were more envelopes, more letters. Bank statements showing regular transfers to an account she'd never known about. A small photograph slipped out from between pages: a blonde, blue-eyed little boy on a tricycle. The room seemed to spin around her. 50 years of marriage, and she'd never suspected. How many conferences had there really been? How many lies had she believed? How much of their money they'd saved for their children's education, for retirement, had gone to this other woman and her son? "Mom. You in here?" Startled, Ellie looked up to see James standing in the doorway. She hadn't even heard him arrive. "Hey, my flight got in early," he said, then frowned, noticing her expression. "Mom. What's wrong? Is it Dad?" Ellie quickly slipped the letter under a book. "James. I didn't expect you until tonight." She stood up, forcing a smile, though her legs felt unsteady. "Your father's resting. The nurse is with him." James stepped closer, his musician's eyes missing nothing. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just tired," she said, hugging him tightly, grateful for the momentary shield from his scrutiny. "I haven't been sleeping well. Why don't you rest? I'll sit with Dad for a while." Ellie nodded, unable to speak. As she left the study, the letter burned in her mind like a brand. Everything she thought she knew about her marriage, her life, had just crumbled beneath her feet. In the guest bathroom, she splashed cold water on her face and stared at her reflection: a 75-year-old woman with silver-threaded dark hair and eyes that had just witnessed the demolition of 50 years of trust. "What now?" she whispered to herself. With Bob dying in the next room, what could confronting him accomplish? But how could she sit by his side, holding his hand, knowing what she now knew? Can you imagine discovering a devastating secret after 50 years of marriage? Share in the comments which city you're watching from, as this story is just beginning. And prepare yourself, because what Ellie will discover next will change everything she believed about her marriage. For the next 3 days, Ellie moved through her routine like a sleepwalker. She administered Bob's medications, adjusted his pillows, read aloud from his favorite novels, and answered the hospice nurse's questions with practiced ease. To anyone watching, she was the same devoted wife she'd always been. Inside, she was drowning. At night, after James had gone to bed in the guest room, Ellie would return to Bob's study. She'd spread the letters across the desk, arranging them by date, creating a timeline of betrayal that spanned decades. The boy in the photographs grew from a toddler to a teenager, then a young man in a Harvard graduation gown. Bob stood proudly beside him in that one, arm around his shoulders, while Ellie had been at home, hosting a dinner for their actual children. William Robert Miller, she whispered, reading the graduation program she'd found tucked into one of the envelopes. The middle name felt like another slap in the face. Ellie dug deeper into their financial records. The investment losses Bob had lamented when they were trying to save for the kids' college educations coincided perfectly with tuition payments to exclusive private schools. The second mortgage they'd taken out to renovate the house had mysteriously resulted in minimal renovations but corresponded with a large bank transfer right when Catherine Miller purchased a condo in Cambridge. "Mom." James's voice startled her. It was past midnight, and she hadn't heard him come downstairs. Ellie quickly gathered the papers, shoving them into a drawer. "Just looking for some insurance information," she said, her voice remarkably steady. James leaned against the doorframe, studying her with concerned eyes. "You've been in here every night since I arrived. What's going on?" "Nothing, honey. Just trying to get things organized." She forced a smile. "You know how your father kept his papers. The hospice nurse mentioned you seemed distracted during the day. Are you sleeping at all?" "I'm fine," Ellie insisted, standing up. "Just old lady insomnia. Nothing new." James didn't look convinced but didn't press further. "Dad was asking for you earlier." He seemed more lucid than he's been in days. A knot formed in Ellie's stomach. She wasn't ready to face Bob, wasn't sure if she'd ever be ready. What would she say? "I know about your son. I know you've been living a double life for our entire marriage. I know our financial struggles were because you were supporting another family. I'll check on him now," she said instead, brushing past James and heading toward the makeshift bedroom. Bob was awake, his blue eyes clear in the dim light. For a moment, Ellie saw him as he'd been at 30, handsome, vibrant, the man who'd promised to love only her until death parted them. "Ellie," he whispered, reaching for her hand. She took it automatically, years of habit overriding her hurt. His skin felt papery and cool. "Where have you been?" he asked. "I've missed you." "I've been right here," she replied, the double meaning lost on him. "You seem far away," he said, his eyes searching hers. Ellie looked away. "Just tired." "I love you," Bob said, squeezing her hand weakly. "More than anything in this world." The lifer now she knew it must be a lie cut through her like a knife. She wanted to pull her hand away, to demand answers, to rage against his betrayal. But what would that accomplish now? He was dying. Would confronting him change the past or just taint his final days with ugliness? "You should rest," she said instead. Later, alone in their bedroom, the one they'd shared for 5 decades, Ellie sat on the edge of the bed, clutching an old photograph from their honeymoon. They looked so young, so hopeful. Had he been planning his deception even then? Or had it begun later, a momentary weakness that somehow spun into a lifetime of lies? The next morning, James found her staring at old photo albums in the living room. "Mom," he said gently. "I found you crying last night. Please talk to me." "Just remembering," she said, showing him a picture of Bob holding him as a baby. "Your father loved reading to you. He'd do all the voices. It wasn't exactly a lie. Bob had been a loving father to their children. Just not only to their children. He did, James agreed, sitting beside her. But that doesn't explain why you're up all night or why you jump every time his nurse mentions his pain medications need adjusting. Ellie closed the album. When you lose someone slowly like this, memories become complicated. That's all. James didn't look convinced, but he let it drop. Michael called. He and Sarah will be here tomorrow. Tomorrow. All three of her children would be here. Would they see the change in her? Would they ask questions she wasn't ready to answer? And what about Bob's other son? Did William know his father was dying? Had Bob somehow said goodbye to him already? The questions circled in her mind like vultures, giving her no peace. After a restless night, Ellie woke early. The hospice nurse wouldn't arrive for another 2 hours, and James was still asleep. She needed to get out of the house, away from the suffocating weight of secrets and lies. I'm going to see Vivian, she told James after he wandered into the kitchen. I'll be back before Michael and Sarah arrive. That sounds good, Mom, he replied, relief evident in his voice. Vivian always cheers you up. Ellie hadn't told him that cheering up wasn't what she needed. She needed someone who might understand the impossible situation she faced. Vivian Carter lived in a beautiful colonial home across town. At 77, she remained as elegant and sharp as when they'd first become friends 60 years ago. They'd bonded as young wives navigating interracial marriages in an era when such unions weren't just frowned upon but often dangerous. Vivian's winter garden was her pride and joy. Even in early spring, orchids and tropical plants thrived in the glass-enclosed room at the back of her house. The warmth and humidity embraced Ellie as she stepped inside. Well, you look like hell, Vivian said bluntly, setting down her watering can. Her silver hair was twisted into a perfect chignon, her makeup flawless despite the early hour. I feel worse, Ellie admitted, sinking into a rattan chair. Vivian studied her oldest friend. This isn't just about Bob dying, is it? The direct question broke the dam. Tears Ellie had been holding back for days streamed down her face. Between sobs, she revealed everything, the letters, the photographs, the financial deceptions, the son she never knew existed. Instead of the shock Ellie expected, Vivian's face showed something closer to sad recognition. She patted Ellie's hand with her perfectly manicured fingers. I wish I could say I'm surprised, Vivian said softly. But I suspected Thomas had secrets too. Ellie looked up in confusion. Vivian sighed deeply. After Thomas died, I found paperwork for a house in Guadalajara. Bank transfers, school payments. Photographs of 2 children who had his eyes, his smile. A second family. In Mexico. Ellie was stunned. Thomas Carter had been a pillar of the community, a respected banker much like Bob had been a respected professor. A second wife, technically, though obviously not legal. Vivian poured tea from a delicate porcelain pot into matching cups. 3 children. He visited them on his business trips to Mexico City. How did you never? I mean, we've been friends for decades. You never told me. What was there to tell? That my husband had made a mockery of our 38 years together. That while I was hosting charity events and supporting his career, he was building another life with another woman. Vivian's voice, usually so controlled, wavered slightly. What did you do? Ellie asked. What could I do? He was already gone. Vivian stirred honey into her tea. At first, I was going to ignore it. Preserve his memory. Then I got angry, wanted to expose him, destroy the reputation he'd so carefully built. And then I got curious. Vivian smiled sadly. I hired a private investigator. Found the Maria and the children. I went to Mexico. You met them? Ellie couldn't imagine confronting Bob's other family. I did. They were as shocked to meet me as I was to meet them. Maria hadn't known about me either, if you can believe it. Thomas told her he was divorced. Vivian shook her head at the audacity of it all. We cried together. Raged together. Eventually, we found some peace together. Ellie tried to process this. You forgave him? It's not about forgiving or not, dear, Vivian said. It's about what you do with the truth. Truth is like water, it always finds a way, no matter how many dams you build. The wisdom in those words struck Ellie deeply. But Bob is still alive, she whispered. What do I do? Confront him on his deathbed? Let him go without ever acknowledging what I know? What about our children? Do they deserve to know they have a half-brother? Vivian set down her teacup. Those are questions only you can answer. But I will say this, 50 years doesn't become a lie because of a hidden truth. What you had was real, even if incomplete. But how can I look at him now? How can I hold his hand knowing that same hand wrote love letters to another woman? The same way you've held it for 50 years with love, though now it's a more complicated love. Vivian's eyes, deep brown and wise, held Ellie's gaze. You have the right to know the whole truth before it's too late. Not for Bob's sake, but for your own. Ellie's phone rang, interrupting the moment. It was James. Mom, you need to come home. Dad's asking for you, and he seems clearer than he's been in weeks. I'll be right there, Ellie said, then turned to Vivian. I have to go. Vivian walked her to the door. Remember, Ellie, this is your life too. You get to decide what to do with this truth, not him. Not anymore. As she drove home, Ellie felt something shift inside her. The paralyzing shock was giving way to a different emotion, determination. Before Bob left this world, she would know exactly who he had been, and what his betrayal meant for her future. When Ellie returned home, she found Bob sleeping again, the brief period of lucidity already passed. James apologized for rushing her back, but Ellie assured him it was fine. In truth, she was grateful for the reprieve. She wasn't ready to face Bob yet, not until she knew more. That afternoon, Michael and Sarah arrived within an hour of each other. The house filled with the kind of bustling energy that only having all three children present could create. Michael, practical and direct like Ellie, immediately reviewed Bob's medical charts and spoke at length with the hospice nurse. Sarah, the organized one, spread legal documents across the dining room table, ensuring everything was in order. James hovered between them, his artistic temperament making him more attuned to the emotional currents running beneath the surface. Mom, are you okay? He asked quietly when they were alone in the kitchen. You seem different. I'm fine, Ellie replied automatically. Then, seeing his skepticism, she added, I need your help with something, but I need you to keep it between us for now. James's eyebrows rose. Of course. I need to do some research online. Would you show me how to find someone? Later that evening, after dinner, James sat with Ellie in the small home office, away from the others. Okay, what are we looking for? He asked, opening his laptop. I need to find information about a woman named Catherine Miller who lived in Boston. And her son, William. If James thought the request strange, he didn't show it. Any particular reason? Just some unfinished business of your father's I need to resolve, Ellie said, the half-truth bitter on her tongue. James's fingers flew across the keyboard. He was the most tech-savvy of her children, navigating search engines and databases with ease. Catherine Miller from Boston, there are several. Do you know when she was born, or any other details? She would have been about my age, I think. And her son William would be around 50 now. Ellie tried to keep her voice steady. After nearly an hour of searching, they found an obituary from 1997. Catherine Miller had died of a cerebral aneurysm at age 47. The obituary mentioned she was survived by her son, William Robert Miller. That's her, Ellie whispered, her heart pounding as she saw the middle name that matched Bob's. James didn't seem to notice her reaction. Let's see if we can find the son. More searching brought them to the faculty page of the same university where Bob had taught for 35 years. There, among the physics department professors, was William R. Miller, Ph.D. That was easy, James remarked. Want me to write down his contact information? Ellie stared at the photograph on the screen. The resemblance was unmistakable, the same blue eyes as Bob, the same way of holding his head slightly tilted, even the same cleft in his chin. This was Bob's son, without a doubt. Yes, please, she managed to say. After James left to join his siblings in the living room, Ellie sat alone, staring at the printout. William Miller lived in Cambridge, taught at the same university as Bob, and based on the faculty biography, specialized in quantum physics. He had graduated from Harvard, earned his doctorate at MIT, and had published extensively in prestigious journals. Bob's son had followed his father into academia, though in a different field. Had Bob guided his career? How often had they seen each other over the years? Did William know about her and her children? That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Ellie made a decision that surprised even herself. She would go to Boston and see William Miller in person. She needed to know the extent of Bob's deception before confronting him. The next morning, she told her children she needed a day to herself. "I've been caring for your father non-stop," she explained. "The hospice nurse will be here all day, and you three can manage. I just need some time." "Of course, Mom," Sarah said, though she looked concerned. "Take all the time you need." "Where will you go?" Michael asked. "Just to visit Vivian again," Ellie lied, hating the deception but seeing no alternative. "Maybe do some shopping." Instead, she packed an overnight bag and caught the morning train to Boston. Her arthritic hands trembled as she purchased the ticket. At 75, she had never done anything like this, traveling alone to confront a painful truth, investigating her husband's secret life. On the train, Ellie studied her reflection in the window. Silver threads ran through her dark hair, and lines mapped the journey of her 75 years across her face. Who was this woman taking such a bold step? She hardly recognized herself. For decades, she had been defined primarily as Bob's wife and her children's mother. She had supported Bob's career, raised their children, volunteered in the community, always putting others first. Now, for perhaps the first time, she was acting solely for herself to discover her own truth. As the train pulled into Boston's South Station, Ellie felt a surprising surge of strength. She was terrified of what she might learn, yet somehow empowered by taking this journey. In her small hotel room near the university campus, Ellie carefully laid out the clothes she would wear tomorrow to attend William Miller's lecture. According to the department website, he taught an undergraduate physics class at 10 a.m. She looked at herself in the mirror again, asking the question that had haunted her since finding the first letter: "Who are you really, Eleanora Johnson Thompson?" The answer came in a determined whisper: "I'm about to find out." After a nearly sleepless night, Ellie arrived at the campus cafe 15 minutes early. She chose a quiet corner table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea for warmth and stability. The weight of James's call hung heavy on her shoulders, but she reminded herself that she might never get another chance to learn the truth. William arrived precisely on time, his resemblance to Bob even more striking in casual clothes, khakis and a blue button-down shirt that matched his eyes, just like Bob used to wear. "Mrs. Johnson," he greeted her, setting down his coffee. "I hope you haven't been waiting long." "Please, call me Ellie," she said. "And no, I just got here myself." William nodded, settling into the chair across from her. "So, you knew my mother when I was young?" "Yes," Ellie said, sticking to her story. "We lived in the same apartment building briefly. I moved away when you were about 3. She paused, then carefully added, Catherine and I weren't close friends, but we spoke often. She mentioned your father sometimes. Something flickered in William's eyes, caution, perhaps. Did she? What did she tell you about him? Ellie took a deep breath. Not much. Just that he wasn't able to be part of your daily lives. William studied her for a moment, then seemed to relax slightly. That's true. My biological father was complicated. He took a sip of his coffee. He was married with his own family, but he was still part of my life growing up. Ellie's heart pounded so loudly she was sure William must hear it. He visited regularly, William said, his tone matter of fact. At least 3 times a year, sometimes more. He never missed a birthday. Each word landed like a physical blow. 3 times a year. Bob's academic conferences that had been a fixture of their family calendar for decades. Birthdays that he'd sometimes had to miss due to unavoidable commitments. He paid for my education, William continued, unaware of Ellie's inner turmoil. Private school, then Harvard. He helped me buy my first apartment after graduation. A fond smile crossed his face. He was determined I wouldn't start my adult life with student debt. Ellie remembered the financial struggles they'd faced putting their own children through college. The second mortgage. The years of scrimping and saving. All while Bob was secretly funding an elite education for his other son. He was proud of you, she managed to say. He was, William agreed. Especially when I followed him into academia, though in a different field. He wanted me to forge my own path. And your mother? Did she ever remarry? Yes, when I was 8. A good man named Richard Miller. I took his last name legally. He raised me as his own son, though he knew about my biological father. William's expression softened. My mother was lucky to have found 2 good men who loved her. 2 good men. The irony made Ellie feel physically ill. He was there for all the important moments, William continued, pulling out his phone. My graduation, my wedding. He scrolled through photos, then turned the screen toward Ellie. Here he is at my son's birth 3 years ago. My wife and I named our boy Robert, after him. The photo showed Bob, thinner but unmistakable, holding a newborn infant, his face beaming with pride. Ellie remembered that conference in Chicago 3 years ago. The emergency appendectomy that had called Michael away from the family Christmas gathering that same year. How many family events had Bob missed to be with his other family? He looks very proud, Ellie whispered, her voice threatening to break. William studied her face with sudden intensity. Forgive me, but you're not just a friend of my mother's, are you? The directness of the question caught Ellie off guard. What makes you say that? Your reaction to these photos. The specific questions you're asking. William's expression was gentle but firm. Who are you really? The moment of truth had arrived sooner than Ellie had expected. She could continue the charade or reveal herself. Looking into the eyes that were so like Bob's, she chose honesty. My name is Eleanora Thompson, she said quietly. I've been married to Robert Thompson for almost 50 years. William's face drained of color. You're Ellie. His wife. The shock in his voice confirmed what she'd suspected William had known about her all along. Yes, she said simply. William set down his coffee cup carefully, as if afraid it might shatter in his grip. He never said you knew about me. I didn't. Not until a few days ago. Ellie's voice remained surprisingly steady. I found letters from your mother while organizing papers. My husband is dying, Professor Miller. I wanted to understand the truth before he's gone. William ran a hand through his hair, another gesture so like Bob's that it made Ellie's chest ache. I'm sorry. This must be. I can't imagine. Did you know about me? About my children? Your half-siblings? Yes, he admitted. I've always known. He showed me pictures sometimes. Michael, Sarah, and James. He looked down at his hands. He made me promise never to contact you or them. He said you didn't know about me, and that it would destroy everything if you found out. Her children's names on his lips felt like an invasion, yet another theft in a lifetime of Bob's deceptions. I should go, Ellie said, suddenly needing air. My son called last night. Bob's condition is worsening. He's asking for me. As she gathered her purse and cane, her phone rang. It was Sarah. Mom. Her daughter's voice was tight with emotion. Where are you? Dad's fading fast. The doctor says. Her voice broke. You need to come home now. This discovery is just the tip of the iceberg. What would you do in Ellie's place? Subscribe now to not miss the next chapter of this emotional story and share your thoughts in the comments. I'll be on the next train, Ellie told Sarah, her voice somehow steady despite the storm inside her. She ended the call and looked up to find William watching her, his face a mixture of concern and shock. Your father is dying, she said simply. I need to go. William nodded, then surprised her. Let me drive you to the station. It's the least I can do. Part of Ellie wanted to refuse to keep this man, this living proof of Bob's betrayal, at arm's length. But a deeper part recognized that William was as much a victim of Bob's deception as she was. Neither of them had asked for this situation. Thank you, she said finally. The drive to the station was mostly silent. Ellie stared out the window, processing the revelations of the morning. William kept his eyes on the road, occasionally glancing at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. I should have known, he said abruptly as they neared the station. When I was younger, I used to imagine meeting you. I'd make up scenarios where Dad would finally introduce us, and we'd become one big happy family. Ellie turned to him, surprised by his candor. My mother told me it was a fantasy, he continued. She made me promise never to interfere in your lives. She said it wasn't fair to you or your children. Your mother sounds like she was a thoughtful woman, Ellie said, meaning it despite the complicated emotions swirling inside her. She was. William pulled into the station drop-off area and parked. She never badmouthed your father, even though she had every right to. She said he'd made his choice to stay with his family, and she respected that, even if it hurt. The words hit Ellie like a physical blow. His choice to stay? What do you mean? William looked uncomfortable. I probably shouldn't be telling you this now. Please, Ellie said. I need to know everything. William sighed, then nodded. When my mother got pregnant, Dad initially promised to leave you and marry her. But after I was born right around the time your oldest son had some major health crisis he changed his mind. Said he couldn't abandon his family after all. Ellie's mind flashed back to Michael's severe asthma attack at age 3, the one that had landed him in the hospital for a week, his tiny body struggling for each breath. Bob had been distraught, hovering by their son's bedside day and night. He told you this? My mother did, years later. She wasn't bitter about it, she said she understood his decision. William gave a sad smile. And honestly, it worked out for the best. My stepdad was amazing there for me every day, not just on special occasions. The train station PA system announced the next departure to Willowbrook. Ellie needed to go, but something held her in place. There's something else you should know, William said hesitantly. Dad changed his will recently. He called me about it a few months ago. He's included me as a beneficiary. Another shock, another betrayal. How many more were waiting to be discovered? I see, was all she could manage to say. I told him I didn't want or need his money, William continued quickly. I have a good career, a comfortable life. But he insisted. Said it was important to him that he acknowledge me formally, even if only after he was gone. Ellie nodded, too overwhelmed to respond. She reached for the door handle. Mrs. Thompson, William said suddenly. Ellie. I'm sorry. For all of this. If I had known you didn't know about me. It's not your fault, she said, and meant it. You didn't create this situation. As she stepped out of the car, William called after her. Would you let me know? After he's gone. The request was so human, so understandable, that Ellie felt a surprising surge of empathy for this stranger who was also her husband's son. Yes, she promised. I'll call you. On the train back to Willowbrook, Ellie sat motionless, staring out the window as the landscape blurred past. Her mind was filled with images, Bob holding baby William, Bob sitting proudly at William's Harvard graduation, Bob cradling William's newborn son, his namesake. All while their own family carried on, unaware of the parallel life he was leading. She looked at the photographs on her phone, holiday gatherings, family vacations, anniversary celebrations, seeing them through new eyes. Every smile, every moment of apparent contentment on Bob's face, now seemed suspect. Had he been comparing their modest home to Catherine's? Had he been mentally tallying the cost of their children's state college tuitions against William's Harvard education? By the time the train pulled into Willowbrook Station, Ellie had moved beyond shock and into a strange, calm clarity. Whatever confrontation awaited her with Bob, she would face it with dignity and strength she hadn't known she possessed a week ago. Sarah was waiting at the station, her lawyer's composure cracking around the edges. Mom, where have you been? We've been worried sick. She helped Ellie into the car. Dad's been asking for you constantly. Is he still conscious? Ellie asked. In and out. The hospice doctor says it could be hours or days. Sarah gave her mother a searching look. What's going on, Mom? James said you were in Boston, but he wouldn't say why. I'll explain everything, Ellie promised. But first, I need to see your father. Alone. When they arrived home, Michael and James were in the living room, tension evident in their postures. Their relief at seeing Ellie quickly transformed into confusion at her calm demeanor. He's waiting for you, Michael said. The nurse just gave him his pain medication, so he's lucid for now. Ellie nodded, then walked steadily toward the bedroom where her husband of 50 years lay dying. She felt her children's concerned gazes following her, but she didn't look back. Whatever happened next would be between her and Bob alone. The bedroom was dimly lit, heavy curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. Medical equipment hummed softly, marking the steady rhythm of Bob's declining life. The hospice nurse nodded respectfully to Ellie and quietly left the room, closing the door behind her. Bob looked dramatically worse than he had 2 days ago. His skin had taken on a waxy, translucent quality, and his breathing was shallow and labored. But his eyes, those striking blue eyes that had first drawn Ellie to him decades ago, were clear and alert as they fixed on her. Ellie, he whispered, reaching out a trembling hand. You came back. She approached the bed slowly, not taking his outstretched hand. For the first time in their marriage, she stood over him not as the devoted wife but as a woman seeking answers. Where were you? He asked, his voice raspy from disuse. The children wouldn't tell me. I was in Boston, Ellie said simply, watching his face. Nothing in her tone suggested anything unusual about her trip, but Bob's reaction was immediate. His eyes widened, and his breathing quickened enough to trigger a small alarm on one of the monitors. Boston, he repeated, the single word laden with unspoken questions. Yes. Ellie pulled the yellowed envelope from her purse and placed it on the bed beside his hand. I found this while looking for insurance papers in your study. And then I found many more like it. Bob's gaze fell to the envelope, recognition and then defeat washing over his features. For a long moment, he said nothing, his eyes fixed on Catherine's handwriting. How, he finally managed. Does it matter? Ellie asked. The point is that I know, Bob. I know about Catherine. I know about William. Bob closed his eyes, tears seeping from beneath his eyelids. I never meant for you to find out this way. How did you mean for me to find out? After you were gone. Through a surprise bequest in your will. The bitterness she'd been suppressing rose to the surface. Or did you plan for me to never know at all? I don't know, he admitted, his voice barely audible. I told myself for years that I would tell you someday, when the time was right. He opened his eyes again, meeting her gaze directly. But the right time never came. I met him, Ellie said. Your son. Bob's expression shifted to shocked disbelief. You met William? How? I went to the university. I watched him teach. I spoke with him. Ellie's voice remained steady, even as she felt anything but. He looks just like you, Bob. He has your eyes, your mannerisms. Even the way he tilts his head when he's listening, it's exactly like you. Bob seemed unable to process this development, his mouth opening and closing without sound. He told me everything, Ellie continued. How you visited regularly. How you paid for his education, Harvard, no less. How you were there for his graduation, his wedding. Her voice finally cracked. The birth of his son. Your grandson, who bears your name. Ellie, please. Bob began, but she cut him off. Do you have any idea what this feels like? To discover that the life we built together for 50 years was based on lies. That you maintained a whole separate family while I thought we were struggling to make ends meet. The calm she'd maintained began to fracture. You made me believe we couldn't afford better colleges for our children because of investment losses, when really you were funding an elite education for your other son. It wasn't like that, Bob protested weakly. I loved you, love you. Always. And Catherine? Did you love her too? Bob turned his face away, unable to meet her eyes. William told me something else, Ellie said, her voice dropping lower. He said you originally planned to leave me for Catherine after she got pregnant. Bob flinched as if struck. That was a moment of weakness. Of panic. What changed your mind? Was it just Michael's asthma attack? A convenient excuse to stay with your real family? No, Bob whispered. You were always my real family. You, Michael, Sarah, James. What I had with Catherine was different. Different, Ellie repeated flatly. For 50 years, you divided yourself between two families. You missed birthdays, anniversaries, school events, claiming work obligations to be with them. You diverted money that should have secured our children's futures. You stood in our kitchen, worried aloud about retirement savings, while secretly buying property for your other family. She picked up the framed photo from his bedside table, the 5 of them at their 40th anniversary celebration. Every smile, every touch, every moment we shared, was any of it real? Or was I just the convenient wife who gave you respectability while you lived the life you really wanted elsewhere? Bob reached for her hand with surprising strength. Listen to me, Ellie. I made terrible choices. Unforgivable choices. But what we had was real. I swear it. His breathing became more labored as he grew agitated. I loved Catherine, yes. And I love William. But you were the center of my world. Always. Pretty words, Ellie said, pulling her hand away. But your actions tell a different story. Our children, Bob said, his voice urgent now. Do they know? Not yet. Relief flooded his features. Please, Ellie. Let me go without them hating me. Tell them afterward, if you must, but let me say goodbye to them with their love intact. The request struck Ellie as the final selfishness, Bob wanting to die with his image unsullied, leaving her to deal with the aftermath, the questions, the hurt. Why should I protect you now? When did you ever protect me from pain? Never, he admitted, tears flowing freely. I failed you in every way that matters. But I'm begging you, not for my sake, but for theirs. Let them remember the father they thought they knew. The monitor beside the bed began beeping more rapidly as Bob's heart rate increased. The door opened, and the hospice nurse looked in with concern. "Is everything all right?" she asked. Ellie straightened her shoulders. "We're fine," she said firmly. "My husband and I are having an important conversation. We need more time alone." The nurse hesitated, then nodded. "I'll be right outside if you need me." As the door closed, Ellie looked down at Bob, the man she'd loved, hated, and somehow still loved despite everything. The decisions she made in the next few moments would define not just his end, but her beginning. "Tell me everything," Ellie said, pulling a chair close to Bob's bed. "I need to hear it all, from the beginning. I deserve that much." Bob nodded weakly, his eyes never leaving her face. "You deserve more than I can ever give you now." He began his confession haltingly, his voice growing stronger as he committed to the truth. He'd met Catherine Miller in 1969, shortly after Michael was born. She was a graduate student in one of his literature seminars, brilliant, passionate about poetry, and, as he admitted with visible shame, clearly infatuated with her professor. "The affair was brief," he said. "Just a few months. I knew it was wrong. I had you, I had Michael, I had everything I'd ever wanted." He paused, struggling for breath. "But I was weak, Ellie. Flattered by her attention. Excited by the secrecy of it all. When Catherine discovered she was pregnant, Bob had panicked. She'd refused to terminate the pregnancy, determined to have the child with or without his support. I promised her money, help with expenses. I thought that would be the end of it." His face contorted with remembered turmoil. "But then William was born, and I saw him, and he was my son, Ellie. I couldn't just walk away." "So you created a second life," Ellie said, her voice flat. "Not at first. At first, it was just financial support, occasional visits." Bob's eyes clouded with memory. "But William was such a bright child. So curious, so eager to learn. Every time I visited, it became harder to leave." "Did you love her, Catherine?" Bob hesitated, then nodded slightly. "Not like I loved you. Never like that. But yes, in a different way." The honest answer hurt more than a denial would have. A moment of weakness might have been forgivable, but decades of divided love was a wound too deep to heal. "I was going to tell you," Bob insisted, his voice breaking. "So many times, I nearly did. But first it seemed too early, then too late. There was always a reason to wait. To wait until I discovered it myself?" Ellie asked. "Or until you were gone and wouldn't have to face the consequences?" "I was a coward," Bob admitted. "The longer it went on, the more impossible it seemed to confess. William said you almost left us when he was born." Ellie needed to hear his version of this crucial moment. Bob's face crumpled in shame. "It's the greatest regret of my life that I even considered it." He took a shuddering breath. Catherine was pushing for commitment. She'd been patient, but she wanted William to have a full-time father. He described the moment in excruciating detail, purchasing plane tickets for the three of them to start a new life in California, packing a suitcase secretly, writing a letter of resignation to the university. "The morning I was supposed to leave, Michael had that terrible asthma attack," Bob said, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "You called me at my office, frantic. By the time I got to the hospital, he was in the ICU." Ellie remembered that terrifying day vividly, 3-year-old Michael struggling to breathe, his tiny chest heaving, his lips turning blue. The fear had been overwhelming. "Seeing you there, holding his hand, singing to him even as you were terrified." Bob's voice faltered. "I knew I couldn't leave you. Couldn't leave him. It would have destroyed all of you. So instead, you decided to live a double life," Ellie said. "To be a part-time father to William while pretending to be fully present with us. I thought I could manage it. Give both families what they needed. Bob's expression revealed the depth of his self-deception. I told myself I was doing the right thing by not abandoning either of you. But you were never fully present with us, Ellie countered. All those missed piano recitals, those parent-teacher conferences you couldn't attend, the anniversaries you celebrated a day late because of conferences. I know, Bob whispered. I robbed all of you most of all, Ellie. The pain medication was wearing off. Ellie could see it in the tightening around his mouth, the way his hands clutched at the blanket. Yet something drove him to continue, to empty himself of secrets before the end. After Catherine married Richard, things became more structured. He was good to William, raised him as his own. Bob's eyes sought understanding in Ellie's. But I remained involved. I couldn't not be his father, even from a distance. And the money? Ellie asked. The private schools, Harvard, the apartment you bought him. I wanted to give him every advantage, Bob said simply. Just as I wanted that for our children. Except our children didn't get private schools or Ivy League educations without crushing student loans, Ellie reminded him bitterly. You diverted our family's resources to your secret son. I tried to balance it, Bob protested weakly. The money I inherited from my parents went mostly to William's education. Our family money stayed separate. Ellie laughed without humor. As if money in a marriage can ever be truly separate. Bob's monitor began beeping again as his vital signs fluctuated. Ellie knew she should call the nurse, but they weren't finished. Not yet. William told me you changed your will, she said. Were you ever going to tell me about that? Bob looked away, confirmation enough. So I would have found out after the funeral. When the lawyer revealed that half of your estate was going to a son we never knew existed? The magnitude of the betrayal threatened to overwhelm her. How did you expect our children to react to that? I don't know, Bob admitted. I just knew I couldn't die without acknowledging him formally. Without making sure he knew that you what? Loved him? Ellie stood up, suddenly needing distance. You think a bequest makes up for a lifetime of secrets? For making him promise never to contact us? For denying him siblings, a full relationship with his father? Bob's breathing became more labored, his face contorted in both physical and emotional pain. Please, he gasped. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but our children. Our children deserve the truth, Ellie said firmly. Just as I deserved it. Just as William deserved it. After, Bob pleaded. Tell them after. Let me die as the father they believe me to be. Ellie looked down at the man she had loved for half a century, diminished now by illness and by the weight of his confessions. Despite everything, her heart ached for him, for the good parts of their life together, for the father he had been to their children, however imperfect. I need to think, she said finally. The nurse should check on you. As she turned to leave, Bob caught her hand with surprising strength. Ellie, he whispered. Whatever you decide, know that loving you was the truest thing I ever did. She gently removed her hand from his grip and walked out of the room, closing the door quietly behind her. The hours following her confrontation with Bob were the longest of Ellie's life. She sat in the garden behind their house, the spring afternoon growing cooler as the sun began its descent. Her children took turns checking on her, concern evident in their faces, but she assured them she just needed time alone. In truth, she was grappling with an impossible decision. Should she grant Bob's request to let him die with his children's love intact? Or did her children deserve to know the truth before their father passed, giving them a chance to confront him as she had done? As dusk settled over the garden, James came outside with a cup of tea and a gentle reminder that Bob was asking for her again. The nurse says he's more lucid now, but it might not last, James said, his dark eyes so like her own searching her face. What's going on, Mom? What happened in Boston? I'll explain everything, she promised. But I need to see your father first. When Ellie entered the bedroom, she found Bob awake, his breathing shallow but steady. The medication had temporarily eased his pain, bringing a clarity to his eyes that reminded her of the man she had loved for so long. "Ellie," he whispered, reaching for her hand. This time, she took it, feeling the paper-thin skin and prominent bones beneath her fingers. "I've been thinking," she said, sitting beside him. "About what you asked." Bob waited, his blue eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that belied his weakened state. "I'm angry," Ellie admitted. "Angrier than I've ever been in my life. You stole so much from me, from our children. Years of trust. And honesty that we can never get back." Bob's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't interrupt. "But I've been thinking about what Vivian told me," she continued. "That 50 years doesn't become a lie because of a hidden truth. What we had was real, even if it was incomplete." She looked down at their joined hands, hers dark brown, his pale white, both mapped with the veins and spots of age. Hands that had held each other through births and deaths, triumphs and failures. "We both made mistakes, Bob," she said, surprising herself with the words. "Yours were bigger, but I wasn't perfect either. There were times I was so focused on the children, on my work, that I didn't see you slipping away. Times I could have asked more questions but chose not to because the answers might have been difficult." "Don't blame yourself," Bob protested weakly. "This was my failing, not yours." "I'm not taking blame for your choices," Ellie clarified. "But I am acknowledging that marriages are complex. That good people can make terrible decisions. That love and betrayal can exist in the same heart." Bob's grip on her hand tightened slightly. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I won't tell our children about William before you're gone." Ellie's voice was steady, her decision made. "Not because you deserve that mercy, but because they deserve to say goodbye to their father without that pain coloring their last moments with you." Relief washed over Bob's face, followed quickly by something deeper: gratitude, humility, and a profound sadness. "Thank you," he whispered. "But I will tell them afterward," Ellie continued firmly. "They have a right to know the truth about their father, and about their half-brother. What they do with that information will be up to them." Bob nodded, accepting her terms. "Will you?" He hesitated. "Will you stay with me? Until the end?" The request hung in the air between them, simple words carrying the weight of their entire history. "Yes," Ellie said after a long moment. "Despite everything, we built a life together. I won't abandon that now." That night, as Bob drifted in and out of consciousness, Ellie sat beside him, sometimes holding his hand, sometimes simply watching the rise and fall of his chest. Their children came and went, sitting vigil in shifts. None of them knew the storm that raged beneath the surface of this seemingly peaceful deathbed scene. In the quiet hours before dawn, Bob awakened with startling clarity. "Ellie," he called, his voice stronger than it had been in days. She leaned forward. "I'm here. I want you to know," he said, each word deliberate and clear, "you were the love of my life. The only constant truth. I'm sorry, so deeply, for not being the man you deserved." The simple honesty of his words broke through the last of Ellie's defenses. Tears she had been holding back for days flowed freely down her cheeks. "I know," she whispered, and found that she did. Bob died as the first light of morning filtered through the bedroom curtains, Ellie's hand in his. The moment was peaceful, almost beautiful in its simplicity, a stark contrast to the complicated life he had led. The following days passed in a blur of funeral arrangements, condolence calls, and the mundane bureaucracy of death. Ellie moved through it all with a strange detachment, as if watching herself from a distance. Her children attributed her behavior to grief, but it was more complex than that. She was preparing herself for what came next. 3 days after the funeral, once the last casserole had been delivered and the house had finally emptied of well-meaning visitors, Ellie called her children to the living room. They came dutifully, concern evident in their faces as they sat around the coffee table where so many family game nights and holiday gatherings had taken place. "There's something I need to tell you about your father," Ellie began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Something I only discovered myself in the past week." She told them everything about Catherine, about William, about the decades of deception and financial duplicity. She showed them the letters and photographs she had found. She explained her trip to Boston and her meeting with their half-brother. The reactions were exactly as she had anticipated. Michael stormed out to the backyard, needing physical space to contain his rage. Sarah, ever the lawyer, peppered her with questions about financial implications and legal ramifications. James sat in stunned silence, his musician sensitivity allowing him to absorb the emotional complexities that his siblings initially missed. "Why are you telling us this now?" Sarah finally asked. "Why not wait until we've had more time to grieve?" Ellie looked at her daughter so much like her in appearance, yet with Bob's analytical mind. "Because you deserve the truth, just as I deserved it. And because somewhere in Cambridge, there's a man who shares your blood. What you do with that information is up to you." As the reality of their father's double life sank in, Ellie felt an unexpected lightness. The burden of the secret was no longer hers alone to carry. Whatever came next, they would face it together as a family, redefined but not destroyed by the truth. 1 year after Bob's death, Ellie stood in the empty living room of the Victorian house on Maple Street. Sunlight streamed through the bare windows, illuminating the faded rectangles on the wallpaper where family photographs had hung for decades. The furniture was gone, most of it sold or divided among the children. All that remained were a few boxes labeled for her new apartment and the echoes of a life that now seemed like someone else's. "Are you sure about this, Mom?" Sarah asked, clipboard in hand as she supervised the last of the moving arrangements. Always the organizer, she had taken charge of the practical aspects of Ellie's transition, though she still struggled with the emotional ones. "I'm sure," Ellie said firmly. 50 years in one place is enough. It's time for something new." The decision to sell the house had shocked her children initially. The Victorian on Maple Street had been the only family home they'd ever known. But Ellie couldn't stay there, surrounded by memories both true and false. Every room held echoes of Bob, the study where he'd hidden his letters, the kitchen where he'd casually discussed their finances while secretly diverting funds, the bedroom they'd shared for decades while he dreamed of another woman. Her new apartment in an active senior living community in New Haven was bright, modern, and most importantly, entirely her own. No ghosts, no secrets, no painful memories lurking in the corners. "The movers are finished," Michael announced, coming in from outside. Of her 3 children, he had taken the revelations about Bob the hardest. His initial rage had eventually settled into a cold disappointment that showed itself in subtle ways: the removal of his father's photographs from his own home, his refusal to discuss Bob except in the most practical terms. "Thank you for helping today," Ellie said, touching his arm gently. He didn't pull away, which she counted as progress. James was the last to arrive, having driven separately. "The apartment looks great, Mom," he said, giving her a warm hug. "I put your plants on the balcony like you asked." Of her 3 children, James had been the most receptive to the truth. His artistic temperament allowed him to hold the complexities of his father's character, the loving parent and the serial liar, without needing to reconcile them completely. "We should get going if we want to beat traffic," Sarah said, checking her watch. The closing attorney said everything's ready to sign. As they prepared to leave, the doorbell rang. James answered it, then turned to Ellie with a questioning look. "There's someone here to see you, Mom." William Miller stood on the porch, looking uncertain and slightly out of place. At 51, the resemblance to a younger Bob was still striking, though Ellie had grown accustomed to it over the past year. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said. "James mentioned you were finishing the move today. I thought I might help." The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Michael's posture stiffened, and Sarah moved protectively closer to Ellie. Despite the handful of cautious meetings over the past year, the relationship between the siblings remained fragile at best. "You're not intruding," Ellie said, breaking the awkward silence. "We were just heading to the attorney's office for the closing. Would you like to join us for lunch afterward?" The simple invitation represented months of careful healing. After the initial shock and anger had subsided, Ellie had reached out to William, not for Bob's sake, but for her own. She wanted to know this person who was, through no fault of his own, connected to her family. Their first meetings had been painful, filled with awkward silences and careful civility. But gradually, a tentative relationship had formed. Not friendship exactly, but something like mutual respect born from shared experience. They had both been deceived by the same man, both lived with half-truths that had shaped their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. The ride to the attorney's office was quiet, each person lost in their own thoughts. After signing the papers that officially transferred ownership of the house to a young couple with 2 small children, they gathered at a nearby restaurant. A toast, James proposed, raising his glass, to new beginnings. They clinked glasses, the gesture symbolic of how far they had come. A year ago, the idea of the 5 of them sharing a meal would have seemed impossible. "Mom, I've been meaning to tell you," Sarah said as they ate. "I've been going through Dad's legal papers, and I found something interesting." She hesitated, glancing at William. Dad had started paperwork to amend his will again, just weeks before he died. There were notes about seeking family counseling, about wanting to bring everyone together. The revelation hung in the air, another piece of the complex puzzle that was Robert Thompson. "He was scared," William said quietly. "He told me once that his biggest regret was keeping us all separate. That he'd realized too late what it had cost everyone." Ellie nodded, not surprised. In those final days, Bob had seemed to be reaching for something closure, perhaps, or a kind of redemption that had remained just beyond his grasp. Later that evening, in her new apartment surrounded by only the possessions she had chosen to keep, Ellie hosted the first meeting of her building's widow support group. The women, ranging in age from 60 to 85, shared stories of loss, adjustment, and unexpected new chapters. When one asked how Ellie had managed to not only survive her husband's death but the devastating discovery that accompanied it, she looked out the window at the community garden below, where residents tended flowers and vegetables with careful hands. "When I discovered the truth, I thought it would erase 50 years of love," Ellie replied. "But I realized that life is rarely that simple. Bob loved me deeply, even while being deeply flawed. I wasn't perfect either. What I learned was that we can choose how disappointments define us. We can let them erase everything that came before, or we can integrate them into a more mature understanding of what it means to love someone for a lifetime." She touched the wedding ring she now wore on her right hand, no longer a symbol of union with Bob, but of her own journey. "The real secret I discovered wasn't about Bob's infidelity," she continued. "It was about my own capacity for reinvention. At 76, I discovered that I can still surprise myself, still grow, still redefine what it means to have a full life." As twilight settled over New Haven, Ellie felt a peace that had seemed impossible a year ago. In her new journal, a gift from James, she wrote the words that would become her mantra: 50 years aren't defined by a single secret, just as a life isn't defined by a single loss. True courage is continuing to write your story, even when someone alters the plot without warning. Thank you for following this emotional journey. If you were moved by this story, please leave a like, share it with someone who needs to hear this message of resilience, and tell us in the comments, what was the most impactful moment of this story for you?